Good morning. I'm Bruce Hoffman, and I'm moderating this panel on terrorism and the war on terror. This is an enormously important panel. If you were listening to the BBC World Service this morning, you will have heard that one of the focuses of the conference this year at Davos is, in fact, the threat of terrorism and the future of terrorism, and that's precisely what this panel wants to examine. In that respect, it's a gateway to really the rest of the program, and particularly to the threat on ensuring security. It's, I think, also a very timely panel. Those of you may remember, especially if you lived in Washington, D.C. last March and April and May, there seemed to be an extraordinary surge of optimism that we had dramatically turned a corner in the war against terrorism. Indeed, the arrest on March 1st of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the infamous KSM, one of the senior operational chiefs of al-Qaeda, the lightning victory during the first phase of, I suppose it's appropriate to say, the first phase of the war in Iraq, had really dramatically led to many people in the administration, in Congress, in the media, making extraordinarily optimistic pronouncements that the war on terrorism had really ended. Certainly the apprehension this past summer of Hambali, another operations chief of not al-Qaeda, of Jamaat Islamiyah, seemed to be more evidence of the progress in the war against terrorism. But then it seems that that all evaporated in November with the 4 suicide attacks in Istanbul, and then especially with events of just the past month, where I think something that's unparalleled since September 11th itself, there was this enormous disruption caused in air travel, the cancellation of flights, the U.S. administration's demand that foreign carriers put air marshals on planes, the sequestering of many arriving flights in Washington, as well as the cancellation, and then really the enormous rekindling of the same sense of fear and anxiety that many of us had felt in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. So given these events, we have to ask, really, where are we in the war against terrorism? And that's precisely what this panel will be getting into. I don't think it's an academic debate or a question of sophistry. If you saw the Financial Times yesterday, Ken Rogoff, the former chief economist of the IMF, was really quite specific in saying that the cost of a spike in anti-terrorism measures can have a profound impact on the world economy. And in fact, he said, quite bluntly, could force globalization into retreat. So I think this is an enormously important issue. To help us make sense of it, we have a very distinguished panel gathered. On my extreme right is the former Prime Minister and Chief of Israel, Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, distinguished warrior Ehud Barak. Next to him is Gareth Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia, currently the President of the International Crisis Group, which is based in Belgium. To my immediate right is Mahnaz Ispahani, a Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York. To my left is Kenneth Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch in the United States. Next to him is Jessica Stern, a lecturer at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and the author of the recent book, Terror in the Name of God. And finally, to my extreme left is Sundeep Waslekar, the President of the Strategic Foresight Group, which is based in India. Before we begin, let me just outline a few of the ground rules. We are going to take no more than a third of the slightly less than 75 minutes that we have for this session with discussions amongst the panel. And I will enforce that very strictly. And then we'll move on to questions, really, for the remainder, the majority of this session, questions from the floor and your comments and your discussions. I will exercise as moderator what I hope won't be interpreted as being too rude, but nonetheless a rudeness in cutting people short. Really, this isn't the place for speeches. The panelists have been asked to be, or instructed as the case may be, as specific and to the point as possible, and I would ask that those of you from the floor, when you speak, that you also be as specific and to the point as possible. Having grown up in the Bronx, perhaps being rude is something that comes quite naturally to me, so I'll certainly be very pleased to exercise it. So, with that said, let me open up the discussion and turn to Ehud Barak. I think there's probably arguably no one in this room that has had quite Mr. Barak's experience over more than 3 decades and actually countering terrorism and countering it in its various manifestations. And really, I think one thing that's characterizing the threat that we face today is it's an enormously dynamic phenomenon. And it's constantly changing. And in that respect, Mr. Barak, I wonder if you could within 3 to 4 minutes or so, outline how terrorism has changed in your experience since you first countered this threat, and also specifically what you see as the key challenges in countering terrorism today that make it much more formidable, much more intractable than it may have been in the past.
With all due respect to our youth performances, I believe that struggle against terror is now much more complicated. 30 years ago, disguised as a maintenance crew leader with white overall and everything, I personally led a rescue raid on a hijacked Sabina airplane at the Ben Gurion airport. When we stormed it, it was full of explosives and detonators in, everything ready to be exploded. It took some 90 seconds of shooting before it was over. We killed 2 of the terrorists and saved all the passengers by 1. But we assumed all along the way that the terrorists will not dare to explode themselves to suicide with the passengers. Can anyone make this assumption before launching a rescue raid these days? A year later, as a part of our global campaign to get rid of all the assassins of our athletes in the Munich Olympics, I disguised as a young lady with everything in place. I headed a commando operation into the heart of Beirut to kill 3 of the terrorists in their apartments with bodyguards and a lot of gendarmerie around the shooting. It was very intensive shooting, but it took 7 minutes before they were killed and 30 minutes before we were back in the sea, sailing back home. No one can expect a special operation unit to get rid of Osama bin Laden or Emmanuel Zuhairi in such a targeted, focused, so short raid. So first of all, it was simpler. Secondly, we fought against organizations that were separated. The Japanese Red Army, the Baader-Meinhof, the Palestinian terrorists. There was very little coordination and cooperation with them. Unlike the situation right now, where we are facing a global challenge. And that carries another element which is different. At least in our case, vis-à-vis the Palestinians, they tried to spread terror in our hearts and souls, to frighten the world, to draw attention for their case. But on the most profound level, they looked to be legitimized by the rest of the world. They asked for legitimacy from all of you. This is not the case with Osama bin Laden. These guys get his orders directly from heaven, and he's ready to destroy whatever comes in his way. For our terrorists, there was an intention to keep it cruel, tough, but with ultimately a political, tangible goal. In Osama bin Laden's case, it's about destroying our whole way of life, and that's what makes it an urgent necessity to win it over both operationally and ultimately politically.
Thank you. Jessica Stern, I mean, given what I was describing, which seems rather a mixed situation, what do you think? Are we safer now than we were before? Are we more secure?
I think you're absolutely right. It is quite a mixed situation. The answer to the question, I believe, is no, we are not safer, but it is important to outline the ways in which the situation is quite mixed. There has been unprecedented and very exciting law enforcement and intelligence cooperation that led to some of the victories that Dr. Hoffman just spelled out. I've seen a big change in the way the FBI operates. I'm American, so I obviously know more about them. Rather than making big arrests and getting credit with the American people, they're focusing more on penetrating the organizations operating in the United States, which I think is a very important change and does make us safer, at least in that regard. But what has happened with the Al-Qaeda organization is that it has transformed itself from a networked organization into a dystopic ideology, a movement that seems to be attracting disaffected people in different parts of the world. They are very successful at bringing in organizations with local, regional agendas to promote their goals, which have evolved from forcing U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia to fighting the so-called New World Order. And it's interesting, that's the language they use, fighting the New World Order. It's very similar to the language used by American identity Christian neo-Nazi groups. And indeed, when I've talked about this, I get complaints. Some of the neo-Nazi groups have emailed me to complain that, of course, this can't be al-Qaeda's agenda. That's their agenda. So that's an important change that I think is one of the reasons why I don't feel we're safer. Also, going into Iraq in the way we did without broad international support really increased the ability of al-Qaeda and its sympathizers to, quote, prove that the objective of the United States is to humiliate the Islamic world more than it was to liberate the Iraqi people. And we know that recruitment to al-Qaeda and related organizations went up as a result of that. And we also know from polling that the level of antipathy to the United States went up dramatically, even beginning before the war. As soon as the war became imminent, Zogby was able to show that that antipathy went up. And of course, after the war, polling has shown that in a number of Muslim-majority states, people have more confidence in bin Laden as a world leader than in President Bush. And this is very distressing because of the way terrorists rely on support from the broader population. It isn't that I expect that a lot of people will now become terrorists in those countries, but rather that terrorists will get logistics support and other kinds of support that they need. We see groups that are not only joining forces to fight the same mission, but in some cases going back and forth. There are groups in Pakistan that I've been studying where individuals hop from one organization to another, and those organizations have purportedly different missions. So, for example, individuals are hopping from Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Harkat groups, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which is a sectarian group, and Al-Qaeda, depending on what's most convenient for them at a given time. We also see the movement taking advantage of a number of weak and failing states. I think it's important to consider, although we've made a lot of headway, at what price, and my colleague Kenneth Roth here will be answering that, but I would just like to say that we must remember that the radius of fear, the radius of psychological damage, is always so much larger than the radius of material damage, and we need to remember terrorism is psychological warfare, and bear that in mind as we respond to this changing and very frightening threat.
Jessica, let me ask you a quick personal question. I mean, given all that, do you think twice about getting on an airplane or about coming to Washington, for example, or traveling overseas? Has anything in your own personal travel patterns changed?
No, nothing in my travel patterns has changed, but I'm no longer as enthusiastic about going to talk to terrorists in the field as I once was. That has changed.
Well, that seems quite sane, actually. Gareth Evans, I mean, what should we make of all these developments? I mean, are we making progress in the war against terrorism? Is it genuine? Is it imagined? Is it something of the two?
Not much good news on the progress front. I think the unhappy truth is that the net result of the war on terror, so far at least, has been more war and more terror. Just do the checklist. In Iraq, the least plausible of all the reasons for going to war, terrorism, has now become the most harrowing of its consequences. So far as Al-Qaeda is concerned, and its offshoots and its affiliates and its franchisees, as I think you've now got to call them, you've got Osama bin Laden still alive, you've got the Taliban regrouping in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, you've got Musharraf doing none of the things really he promised to do about madrasas, that crucial transmission mechanism from moving to to generalised grievance to actually willingness to suicide bomb. In Southeast Asia, you've got Jamar Islamiyah and others damaged but certainly not destroyed. In Israel, you've got suicide bombings continuing. You've got an expansion of the scope of major attacks, as we've seen in Indonesia, Bali, in Istanbul, in Morocco, and Saudi Arabia. And so far as the so-called big one is concerned, that's the linking of the sophistication and ruthlessness of 9/11 with the actual use of weapons of mass destruction. Nobody can be confident that that won't occur. Maybe the motive is certainly there. The capacity may be overstated so far as these groups are concerned, but I don't think our experience shows that we can rely much on intelligence agencies to avert that ultimately happening. It's not all unredeemed bad news. I mean, Jessica's right in saying there has been a lot of international cooperative effort on the law enforcement and resource transmission front. And it's also true, which we sometimes forget, and the US State Department documents this very well, that in terms of the overall numbers of international terrorist incidents, that's been in trend decline for the last 20 years, and that decline is still continuing. The trouble is that as suicide bombing has become the preferred weapon of choice for terrorism, the actual number of casualties per incident has certainly been rising, and that hasn't really stabilised. So there's also, in terms of measuring progress, just a quick point, there's a terminological issue here. The problem about this whole concept of a war against terror, while the language is, the politics apart, quite understandable, I guess, after 9/11, using that sort of language, it's not language which lends itself to clear operational thinking or to assessment of progress. It's a bit like a war on evil. It's interminable, it's unlimited by its very nature. I mean, terrorism is not an enemy. Terrorism is not even an ideology, as anarchism was, for example, in the 19th century. Terrorism is just a tactic, a weapon of the weak against the strong. And how you measure progress in a war, characterised as a war, is a bit nonsensical. Whatever it is, we're not getting it right. There's a few good things going on, but many more less good things. The remaining problems that we've got with terrorism are greater than they ever were. The stakes are higher than they ever were. And we've got to rethink the fundamental strategies that we're applying to this, which is another story for another contribution later on, I guess.
Great. Kenneth Ross, what about the price we're paying in the struggle against terrorism in terms of civil liberties, in terms of the fabric of trust that holds society together? Do you see that fraying?
Well, I think that the biggest price that we've paid is that we've lost the high ground. If you think about it, there was enormous support for the United States in the effort to combat terrorism after 9/11. And as Jessica mentioned, there has been a plummeting of regard for the Bush administration, in particular for U.S. policy, over the last couple of years. And I attribute that in large degree to the fairly one-dimensional approach that the administration has taken to combating terrorism. It has put enormous effort into traditional security methods to combat terrorism, but it has largely neglected efforts to combat what you might call the culture of terrorism, the set of values that lead people, at least passively, to support what the terrorists are doing, and in a small minority of cases, lead people to actively join the terrorists. This culture of terrorism, I feel, if anything, has been fueled by much of U.S. conduct over the last couple of years. And it's not simply, the highly unpopular Iraq War and everything that people have read into that. It's also, Guantanamo having become, in many ways, a symbol of U.S. disregard for international standards. And it's a symbol that represents much more than simply a naval base in Cuba. It represents the enemy combatants in the United States, the proposed military commissions, the use of stress and duress interrogation techniques, the rendering of suspects to places like Syria to be tortured. There's a long list of grievances that people know quite well around the world, and which, in a sense, has left the United States not in the position of saying we are upholding international standards, we are representing the community in denouncing this affront to our basic values, but rather in a very different way. Not that the U.S. is engaging in terrorism, but the U.S. is undermining some of the same international standards that themselves are critical for explaining what is wrong with terrorism, why this is an inappropriate way to pursue legitimate political grievances or illegitimate grievances. And so what this all adds up to, I'm afraid, is that while undoubtedly the Bush administration is leading the war against terrorism, it in an odd way has also become the chief recruiter for al-Qaeda. That is to say, it is directing what are often quite effective security measures in the very narrow sense. But U.S. conduct has become one of the chief rallying cries for those who want to enlist the small percentage of people who will channel their political grievances not into the stultified political systems of Pakistan or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, but into violence. And I think until the Bush administration pursues at least a two-dimensional approach, one that looks at not only security measures themselves, but also at the culture of terrorism, I'm afraid that this entire effort is not going to succeed.
Thank you. Mahnaz Ispahani, is this a struggle we can even talk about winning? And if so, how do we go about winning it?
I get the very tough question. I think that we need to really focus our minds on the kinds of strategies that are sustainable, that make fighting this war a sustainable strategy. I agree very much with Ken that the current emphasis, the balance of emphasis on military and security and intelligence measures are a part of the solution to the problem. They are absolutely not enough. If you just take a look at one of the first front in this war, Afghanistan, and identify what the key problems are there today. It is the problem of narcotics and the production of drugs, which is destroying and setting back all the successes that have been gained to date by the United States when it overthrew the Taliban regime, etc. This kind of problem has to be addressed through international cooperation, through measures and expertise that comes from entirely different fields of development, from agencies that have great expertise in this area, including the United Nations. It takes us into another realm, which is where I think we really have to focus if we're going to think about winning this war. The resurgence of the Taliban is not just a military or security problem. It is also about reincorporating the Pashtuns, who have been completely left out of the political process, back into Afghan politics. The Loya Jirga process has made some progress in this area. There needs to be more, and that requires a dialogue of some length and duration with Pakistan. Winning hearts and minds, this is a phrase that has unpleasant historical connotations, but it's a very critical part of this so-called war. Mr. Wolfowitz talks about a war of ideas. I was traveling recently with the U.S. delegation in Pakistan, and my perception of that entire trip was that American civilians now operate from behind barbed wires, enormous security, very high walls, can meet with hardly anyone. How, in a situation like that, can one practically attempt or succeed at the grand designs that we have and seek to accomplish in this war on terror, reform of the Muslim world, education reform, providing and implementing aid strategies on the ground? Very difficult. How do we participate in this war of ideas inside a part of the world that we feel is producing the worst kind of militant Islam, when we operate physically in such isolation and with such barriers? And finally, I think in the year and the years ahead, there are a few things we have to really focus on, and if we're going to think about winning. One is that under no circumstances can the United States alone win this war on terrorism. And its most pivotal allies are Muslims, who the term we use is moderate Muslims. I think of them as ordinary Muslims, millions and millions of them, who have to fight and win this war on their own terms in their own societies. We can do so much, but there is a great deal that has to come from those communities. And they are feeling increasingly pressured and betwixt and between the policies of the Bush administration and the extremism of the groups that you have heard mentioned here today. Their circumstance is critical to watch in winning the war on terror. Finally, I would say two developments, two areas we should really watch in 2004. Focus, Pakistan, Pakistan, Pakistan. One has been saying this for many years, but by now it should be absolutely evident to us that the billions of dollars that we're pouring into Iraq was an unnecessary diversion, I believe, from what should have been the next front in the war on terror after we went into Afghanistan. It is of critical importance that we focus resources and attention to addressing the dangers that come from Pakistan. And the final point in that connection is one very optimistic sign is the recent initiatives between India and Pakistan towards trying to reach some negotiation on many of their bilateral disputes, but in particular trying to address the problem of Kashmir. Thank you.
Thank you. Ehud, Barak, let me let you jump in for a second before we go to talk about the future.
I would like to make two remarks about the recent arguments. Number one, we should be able not to be paralyzed by the fact that it might take generations for the Muslim world to turn itself, to transform itself. We cannot help it a lot. It might take generations before we see American-like or European-like democracies in the Arab world. It might take a generation before a Muslim, Martin Luther, will nail his thesis on a mosque, on the door of a mosque, and be successful. That should not paralyze us from fighting operationally the threat of terror that can derail our whole way of life. We should bear in mind there is a natural tendency in human beings for self-denial when events like 9/11 become kind of sink into the past. These guys who led the 9/11 attacks are not less capable or less sophisticated than anyone. They might be more evil, not less sophisticated, not less capable than anyone of us here. They will not hesitate to weaponize smallpox and spread it by a guy who is personally even immune. He just not even have to suicide. They will not hesitate to use a small stolen nuclear device once they can put their hand on one. And we should not kind of delude ourselves about the consequences. There is no way to establish the kind of personal safety, stability, and predictability which are the ultimate preconditions for sustained economic growth if this movement led by Osama bin Laden and his groups, and they are not operating as a manufacturing floor or trading floor, they're more like a offshore holding company, lose relationship with other groups, but they are very effective and could be very dangerous. So there is a need to focus on what should be done operationally to put an end to this phenomena, the way our forefathers fought against piracy on the high seas, and realizing that this will not stop trouble from appearing on many corners of the world and will not save us the need to be patient and generous with the rest of the world, helping them to help themselves out of their misery.
Great, thank you. Well, let me ask Sundeep Waslekar to wrap up. We're winning on some counts, losing on others. Where do we go from here?
Bruce, we actually have some answers already provided by some of the earlier panelists, and you have a view from Mahnaz and Jessica that you have to address the psychological warfare, you have to address the socio-economic issues, you have to address the educational reforms, and then you have Mr. Barak suggesting a tough action. But underlying all this is the question of standards. We need common international standards. We need rules of the game. Then implementing those rules of the game, there can be many different ways, as have been pointed out by some of the earlier panelists. What's happening now is that the rules are changing. In 2001, United States considered Taliban to be a twin organization of Al-Qaeda. Now, in 2004, already there are negotiations taking place between Hamid Karzai and Taliban. There are negotiations taking place between Hamid Karzai and some of the other groups which have been partnering with Taliban, and this seems to be acceptable. So if you keep on changing the rules of the game, basically then you have a foreign policy or an international policy which is bereft of any values, any principles. So the basic question is whether you want to go ahead merely on the basis of pursuit of power and mix that with the combat of terrorism, or whether you want to have some essential principles underlying international standards and international rules of the game.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to give the panelists in the last few minutes of the session a chance to react to one another's statements and also anything that was said from the floor. But let's move directly now to comments from all of you. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Ehud. I'm an Arab diplomat. I listened carefully to
There's a microphone coming for you.
I listened carefully to those interventions. It seems that there is a bag full of different items, and the bag is called terrorism. To talk about international terrorism and then involve Iraq, Palestine, the madrasa in Pakistan, I believe it has confused the issue. You have, by turning the campaign against terrorism, which all of us should participate in, by turning this campaign, this war against terrorism, into criticism against Islam, or to serve certain purposes as the Israeli policy vis-à-vis the Palestinians, or what Gareth Evans talked about, the madrasa in Pakistan. Madrasa is school. Many people don't know that this, what Gareth and others call for, is to close those schools. No. Madrasa is just a school that, because of the poverty, there are no other schools, other alternatives for education. So it is linked to development and how to develop societies. But just to say the madrasas in Pakistan and the situation in Iraq and the Palestinian situation because of the occupation of their lands and so many other things, things have to be straightened up. It is not a campaign against Islam. And terrorism is not a Muslim phenomenon. Terrorism, and I believe I heard you, Ehud, talking about Baader-Meinhof, the Red Brigade, the Red Army, those in Ireland, those in Yugoslavia, and in the Balkan, and in Latin America, and in Oklahoma, has nothing to do with Islam. So I believe the time has come to set the record straight, talk about war against terrorism, but separate it from war against Islam, and from war and criticism against Muslims to serve certain purposes. Now, most of what Ehud Barak has talked about was the attacks or their war with the Palestinians, labeling them as terrorism. Not always terrorism. Part of what they do is terrorism, but the rest is resistance against your occupation to their lands. Thank you.
Thank you. Gareth, please.
You can huff and puff and blow the house down, but the truth of the matter is the biggest set of problems we all face in relation to terrorism at the moment are coming out of the Arab Islamic world, and it behoves all of us to focus. And they've also got problems in Colombia, we've also got problems in other places, sure, and that's the idiocy of the notion of war on terror, because it aggregates it all together, and what we have to do is disaggregate. You've got to treat these as separate problems with separate causes and separate appropriate strategies. But in dealing with the phenomenon in a number of parts of the Arab Islamic world, we do have to come to grips with some of these issues, and I would have thought we're talking from the same brief when we say that one of the things that we're not properly doing as an international community at the moment is addressing those political grievances which are such crucial fuelers of grievance and ultimately extreme responses in so many parts of the Arab Islamic world, and the political grievance above all of the non-resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli problem. That ought to be centre front. And if the US and its friends had devoted as much effort to coming to terms with that particular problem, with some creative solutions of the Bail and Rabu kind or whatever, over the last 3 years, rather than going off on a frolic in Iraq, I think we'd be a lot better placed than we are. Similarly, the political grievance that's associated with the way in which the war in Iraq has been conducted and followed through. I mean, it is true that it's just a one big Lord Kitchener type of recruitment poster for resistance right around, for all the reasons that Ken Roth actually said. We have to accept this, not because this stuff goes so much to the motivations of individual terrorists, but it does go to the issue of neutralising community support for terrorism, and it goes to the question of the capacity and the will of the governments from the countries where this stuff is originating actually address the issue. That's why you've got to be seen to be addressing these things and getting them right. And I think you and I have the same agenda in that respect. And it's a mischaracterization to say that all this is just some crusade against Islam. It's not. People are seriously trying to address the underlying root political grievance causes. Finally, on the question of madrasas, I mean, that's really just a misstatement of what I and ICG and others have said about the madrasa problem in Pakistan. Of course, not every madrasas are just schools, sure, but the truth of the matter is that there's been a complete failure by Musharraf and successive Pakistani governments to honour the commitments made to ensure that they're properly regulated, to ensure there's a secular agenda, and to weed out the worst problems associated with them. They've been doing a little bit of that in the last 2 weeks in the Punjab, but God, it's a huge agenda. And they have been breeding jihadis. They have been crucial elements in the transmission from generalised grievance to outright grotesque behaviour. And we have to recognise that reality and devise strategies to deal with it, including development support strategies for Pakistan and other countries to enable them to have a proper education system and not force poor parents to send their kids to the madrasas because that's the only education they're ever going to get.
Kenneth, briefly?
Sure, let me just, I agree very much with what Gareth said. Let me just say that I think one thing that's unsatisfying in talking about terrorism all the time is that we really are just addressing a means. And it is a means that has a commonality across different situations. Palestinian suicide bombing is terrorism, just as Al-Qaeda engages in terrorism. But of course, the champion suicide bombers are the Tamil Tigers, who are in no sense Muslim. And so your point that this problem of means extends well beyond Islam is absolutely correct. I think what's unsatisfying about always focusing on terrorism, though, is that we're not talking about ends. And here I agree with Gareth. You have to look at the same time at the rallying cry, what motivates people who are engaged in terrorism. And you're never going to be able to fully understand what motivates bin Laden, but you can understand some of the more objective political grievances, which are the Israeli occupation, but are also, frankly, the Egyptian government and the Saudi government and the Pakistani government or the Indonesian military, governments that don't allow political pluralism, that are highly repressive. And I think that there's a need, frankly, for leaders like you to address this problem of a lack of democracy and a lack of opportunity for peaceful political participation, which to a large degree is driving subset, a minority of people, into violence when they can't accomplish what they want to in the ordinary political system.
Well,
I do think that it is important that the message that, Gareth, you say is not the message, and I agree it's not necessarily the message, that this is not a war on Islam, that message is just not getting through. And it's not getting through to most ordinary Muslims. And I think if we just dismiss it and say, obviously that's not the message, that's not starting to try and address the problem. And I do think that is something that we have to think about. There are actions which I thought Ken might address in the United States, where the ordinary Muslims, Muslim businessmen, and I even hesitate to call them Muslim, they are self-identifying now more as Muslims, but Pakistanis or Egyptians or Saudis going to the United States do face and feel that they face certain kinds of specific profiling, certain kinds of specific discrimination under the new methods being used to combat the war on terrorism, and I do think that we need to take these into account. They are exacerbating people's the situation of those Muslims that you do want on your side.
Mr. Barak, very briefly.
I highly respect Amro Moussa. We were foreign ministers together and worked a lot to try to iron out things in the Middle East. But I should make a comment about occupation and our conflict with Palestinians. If it were about occupation, we could be well into implemented a solution following Camp David. It is these days not about occupation. It is about a deliberate and conscious choice of Mr. Arafat and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin of Hamas and the leaders of Islamic Jihad to dictate to Israel its policies through suicide bombing. This is something, in spite of all our internal debates in Israel, we will never ever yield to. We will never ever yield to suicide bombing as a new tool of diplomacy. And I mention it just because you have mentioned it's beyond the domain of this discussion. But let me make one comment about the other issues. I believe it's not an Islamic terror, but the world is facing a real threat to our whole way of life that stems out of the combination of terror, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and the easy access that had been created by modernity, the empowering of individuals and terrorist groups by the very easy access to knowledge of biology and even physics. The combination of terror, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and rogue regimes who are ready to host them creates a major threat to the world. We see there North Korea, but we see there Pakistan with its role in proliferation, and we see, unfortunately, too many Muslim players. We cannot deny it and still dealing with it effectively. And I dare to be unpopular here to the best of my judgment as a former leader of Israel and a long-time observer of strategic situation in sensitive areas. The nature of leadership and moral and strategic clarity that was shown by President Bush and Prime Minister Blair and several other European leaders, among them Aznar and some others, had changed the world for the better. We are living in a better world. The very picture of the latex gloves on the hand of young American physician looking into the mouth of Saddam Hussein sent a very important message directly into the heads of Gaddafi and young Assad and some of the extremist ayatollahs in Iran and maybe even Kim Jong-il. And with all our uneasiness with this kind of pictures, it helps the world to be slightly safer, enable us to discuss the phenomena of terror under a tight security arrangement, but in a more calm or tranquil atmosphere.
Thank you. More questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Yaprak Özer. I come from Turkey. You've been talking about terrorism, and I'd like to give you an example of my country. Just a couple of months ago, we had bombings in Istanbul, and in these bombings, many of the Turkish Muslim people have died, and some few Turkish Jewish people have died, and a couple of British people have died, and we have grieved. I am actually scared to go to shopping malls. So I'd like you to elaborate more on terrorism, Muslim to Muslim, Islam to Islam, and is terrorism when it is in the United States or in Europe? And as you all know, my country has fought against terrorism with PKK. PKK was another example of terrorist organization. Now U.S. administration has condemned it with changing names, but many of the European countries have not. How would you explain this? I mean, could you perhaps go beyond September 11 and in Pakistan and in Afghanistan? We also live in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Jessica, these are things that you've thought about and also have some experience from your time in the NSC in dealing with policies.
Yeah, I think we often forget that the original focus, actually, for example, of Egyptian Islamic Jihad was inside Egypt. The original focus was on so-called secular leaders, some of whom are secular and some of whom don't consider themselves to be secular. And so I think that there's no question that Muslims are very, very likely targets. And as Mahnaz and others have pointed out, this is not, terrorism is not an Islamic phenomenon, and it is not a war against Islam. And Mr. Musa, I actually had my book sent to you. I hope you received it. It is about terrorism in 3 religious traditions, and indeed it starts out with a description of a Christian cult. So this is something that we are all susceptible to. However, as Garrett Evans pointed out, the terrorism we worry most about today does come from the Islamic world, but its victims are very likely to be Muslims, equally as much as non-Muslims.
Sundeep?
Yeah, actually, there is a common theme between what Mr. Musa said and our friend from Turkey said. Going beyond 9/11, going beyond Bali bombings, you do have Muslims as majority of the victims of terrorism. But even though empirical evidence shows that terrorism is not an Islamic phenomenon, you have through history and even today, terrorism in Nepal and Latin America and many other parts of the world, it has got equated with Islam in the predominant global discourse. And the responsibility for that is definitely with certain political hawks in the West, but it has also happened because the leaders of the Islamic world have allowed these fringe groups to take over the agenda. The equivalence of terrorism with Islam might have been projected by the Western leaders, but also it has been claimed by Osama bin Laden, it has been claimed by Hafiz Saeed, it has been claimed by Masood Azhar, it has been claimed by Hambali, and I haven't seen any voices from the Islamic world to question the claim of these groups to capture, to own, to define Islam. And therefore, I have a practical thought, which some of the Islamic leaders can consider. In order to separate the equivalence of or separate Islam from terrorism, perhaps the Islamic leaders should consider convening a shura of leading and established Islamic scholars to proclaim as to what exactly does the Islamic teaching have to say about violence and about justice and about use of terror. If Islamic leaders take that initiative, where the shura consists of not government representatives, but leading scholars from Al-Azhar University, from other universities across the world, from Indonesia, from Pakistan, from Egypt, from other parts of the world. And if these Islamic scholars show the courage to proclaim as to what exactly Islam has to say about terrorism and whether the acts of Osama bin Laden and Hafiz Saeed and others are legitimate from the Islamic point of view or not, that itself will go a long way in clarifying the issue.
I'm going to ask you to hold your comment to the wrap-up because time is running away from us, and I want to give the floor as much opportunity as possible. Yes, sir.
Just to pick up on this theme, and at the risk of sort of lumping some of this stuff together when there is much more nuance, one red thread, though, that does seem to run through all the variety of at least the terrorism that we talk about in terms of what Israel is facing and some of these issues is really the issue of fundamentalism. And by fundamentalism, I'm not just restricting this to Islam. I mean fundamentalist Christianity, fundamentalist Hinduism, fundamentalist Judaism, which really has a different vision of the world, where the idea of separating the secular from the sacred is a profane idea. And a significant amount of the populations in these countries cannot comprehend, for example, the way we do in this room, who sort of see the separation of the secular and the sacred. The idea of that is really an affront to their sense of identity, an affront to themselves. And it seems that unless we're able to sort of take apart this issue of fundamentalism, which is the common aspect of whether it's right-wing Christianity or with respect to the occupied territories in the pre-1967 borders, that unless we find a way to sort of take this apart and separate it, most people will simply not identify with the alternative vision that we have of the world, of sort of a global interdependent entity.
Well, let me, if I could, maybe rephrase your question a little bit, because I think that the problem isn't necessarily fundamentalism if by that one means simply a desire to lead one's own life according to a fairly literalist interpretation of the scripture. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem arises if one wants to or insists on imposing that vision on others. And I don't think that has anything to do with fundamentalism necessarily. It rather has to do with a lack of respect for pluralism, a lack of respect for other people's interpretation of their religion, or for that matter, their non-religion. And it's that lack of tolerance that is the problem, but I think that's quite distinct from fundamentalism. If I could just for a moment, on the Turkey point, I just wanted to come back for a second there, because I think that Turkey is at an incredibly important stage right now. The Turkish government was for many years doing everything wrong in the face of its very severe terrorism threat from the PKK. And the Erdogan government now, an Islamic government, a moderate Islamic government, is suddenly making gigantic steps toward introducing ethnic pluralism, allowing Kurds to lead more normal lives, and also, frankly, religious pluralism, moving beyond a sort of secular fundamentalism to allow the beginnings of Islam to just express itself more normally in official practices. If that trend continues, if the government continues to outlaw torture and allow greater freedom of expression and the like, it is absolutely essential that Europe open the doors this coming December, when the decision is going to be made about setting a date for negotiations for Turkey's accession into the EU. Because Europe and the West as a whole has an enormous stake in the success of the Turkish experiment. Because this is an opportunity to show that you can have an Islamic government that is tolerant, is pluralistic, that it is not equating Islam with fundamentalism. And it is very much in everybody's interest to see that experiment succeed. But if Europe slams the door shut and says no, I'm afraid that there will be severe retrenchment in Turkey, and that will set back efforts in the entire region to promote greater pluralism.
The gentleman in the rear.
Tony McMichael from the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. I appreciate the comment that was made a moment ago about the role of fundamentalism, but I actually want to come back to the comment that Gareth Evans and Kenneth Roth made about political grievance, because I think that really underlies much of the problem that we're addressing in this session. And I must, frankly, I appreciate a little less Mr. Barak's comment that offers the analogy with 18th and 19th century piracy on the high seas, because I think where that might have had to do with materialism and selfishness and adventurism, when we're talking about terrorism in the modern world, we are talking about something that goes much deeper. And I think all of us recognise that it has very much to do with the sorts of political grievances that have been referred to here. These grievances, I think, are not confined within countries, as we've heard described, but of course extend more globally today, and in many ways reflect the grievance across the widening rich-poor gap in the world, which is a topic that we'll hear discussed in other sessions at this forum. So I must say, coming myself from a public health background, one of our enduring concerns is that whilst we can always try to find short-term remedial responses, the real issue is to understand the underlying causes and to develop preventive strategies. And I'd suggest that as well as talking about the war on terror, which clearly must go ahead to deal with the immediacies, we've got to think about the long-term prevention of terror, which requires us to understand rather better these political grievances.
Before I give Mr. Barak the opportunity to respond, let me just point out that piracy, of course, has never been abolished. In fact, it's resurging as a severe problem, particularly in the South Pacific. But Mr. Barak.
I mentioned the piracy on the high seas from the technical, operational aspect of fighting it, namely the whole world joined hands. Every vessel of pirates became a target. Every harbor who hosted them or gave them fresh water or citrons became automatically isolated from the rest of the world, and within a generation the phenomena was over. I did not try to compare it on more profound level of the ideological objectives. And I think that we need this kind of cooperation on operational intelligence, databases, diplomatic and economic levels in order to defeat terror on operational ground in order that we will be able to run this kind of discussions, as I mentioned. But let me add another point. I think that the real achievement of Osama bin Laden, in spite of all his aides that were killed along the way and the destruction of the Taliban regime and it becoming kind of hiding in a cave somewhere on the border, is that he ignited the imagination of hundreds of millions in the Arab world. That his ultimate weapon. That what gives him hope and patience and the kind of evil optimism. And that brings me to the remark that you have made on the other side of the podium. I think that that's the most important long-term recommendation that was heard during this discussion, that the religious leaders of the Arab world will gather in Al-Azhar or somewhere else and issue the proper decision, fatwas or other decisions that will define what is Islam really about. The way that Judaism had passed long ago, that Christianity had passed several hundred years ago, to find a Islamic equivalent of the categorical imperative of Kant or some of the sayings of our old sages. This is what really needed. There is in the transcripts of the big monotheistic religions, you can find what you look for. You can find justification for the most bizarre extremism. You can find the roots of humanity in all of them, including Islam, and I read carefully into Arkan al-Islam and into the Quran. You can find it if you want to find it. And unless this becomes the norm, the leading interpretation of Islam, we will face what the historian Toynbee told us 70 years ago, that Islam is still a vitalist movement that aspires to control the world, not just to settle relationship between human beings, heaven, and their other human beings around them.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Tom Fenton, CBS News. Just one small question for Mr. Waslekar. What makes you think that Islamic leaders would agree on what's in and what's out, and what's beyond the pale and what's acceptable? That they would come up with some common definitions?
Well, I'm not suggesting at all that they will necessarily agree. I hope that they want to agree to redefine Islam and take it away from the hands of a few fringe elements. Just now, Ambassador Musa, who is a very distinguished Arab leader, told us that terrorism should not be equated with Islam. Now, if that is the case, and I agree with him that terrorism should not be equated with Islam, then it is also for the Islamic leaders to define what Islam is all about and to separate it conceptually from terrorism. There is a more fundamental problem, and that problem is about the whole concept of what kind of world we want, and the view that is promoted by Ayman Zawahiri, Sayyid Qutb, and others. It's not that they want Islamic supremacy necessarily. What they're questioning is the evolution of the state system that has happened in the course of last 300, 400 years, where we have more or less agreed that there should be a separation of church or separation of religion from state, and a separation of state from economy. What these people want is the unity of religion with state and unity of state with economy. And this is sheerly because that is the only way they can have total power, a total control. So it's not so much Islam versus West. It's extremism and a desire for totalitarianism versus liberalism. And you have this kind of a thinking in the Islamic world, represented by Sayyid Qutb and others. You also have this kind of a thinking in the Western world, no doubt about that. I mean, there are people in the United States who have forgotten that the Declaration of Independence was about pursuit of happiness and pursuit of freedom. They think that the Declaration of Independence was about pursuit of power. And in the pursuit of that power, they would use any tool, including misdefining religions and their role. So there is a responsibility on this side, but there is also a responsibility on the other side.
Mahnaz?
I think that across many Muslim countries, Muslim political leaders and religious leaders are saying these things that Sundeep would like them to say. If you look at Indonesia, Nahdlatul Ulama, 40 million members, are saying these things. Religious institutions, President Musharraf of Pakistan is saying these things. Many other leaders in the Muslim world are saying these things. Perhaps they're not being heard, but there are many communities, both religious and the head of Al-Azhar says these things. I read them. So these interpretations of Islam, the contest within the Muslim world is going on. People on both sides are speaking. Unfortunately, what the power of the suicide bomber that Gareth Evans refers to attract attention, media, the fear of people, is much stronger than these very reasonable interpretations that are being put forward. And you know, I'm not saying that it is what is being done is sufficient, but we must pay attention to those voices in the Muslim world that are speaking in these ways and raise them up. And that is a responsibility also of the Western media. So I'd just like to make that point.
Yes.
Sharon Burrow, the President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions and of the Asia Pacific Group of Trade Unions. I want to do what dreadful women like me do all the time and say, while there are two fantastic women on the panel, where is the role and the voice of women in the solution to this set of challenges to global order? It seems to me that no religious doctrine, nor indeed response to date to these questions has served well the aspiration of women, and you only have to have a look at Afghanistan. But that debate is not really just about representation of women. It's about seriously listening to the dialogue that goes on when women are invited into the tent, because it's very different to this one. It is about a set of values, shared values. It is about aspirations for families, for job security, for all of the attendant rights to freedom. I actually think the dichotomy between the fight for the freedom, fight for freedom and the fight for power is probably a good one in terms of, as characterised by our friend here on the panel. But I genuinely worry about the world order again being shaped in response by men, largely, I would argue, for men, to the detriment of women, but frankly without the partnership of women. And it would be terrific to hear a set of responses. I think we'd have fixed the Palestinian-Israeli question a long time ago, frankly, if women had been at the helm.
I really appreciate your comment. It has been shown that when there is a high ratio in the population of males to females, a society is more prone to violence. It has also been shown by colleagues of mine at Kennedy School, Pippa Norris, together with Ron Engelhardt, that when women don't receive, are held back in terms of their education and also health care, that freedom indicators go down, that the likelihood of democracy, a liberal democracy, taking off and succeeding is highly correlated with the level of education of women. So I do think it's a very important factor in predicting peace and prosperity. Also in regard to healthcare, it's very important that women be educated to keep a population healthy. So these are very important, and it unfortunately, where we see the worst ratios, a lot of that unfortunately does seem to be in the Arab countries.
Thank you for that comment. I think I appreciate it, and it's very welcome. I think that the women's peace movement, as you know very well, has been very active for a long time across the world. And one of the things I find particularly interesting is that until really 9/11, women's rights and status did not feature as an element in any President of the United States speeches. Now, since 9/11, you will find every foreign policy think tank, every international policy institute suddenly extremely concerned about the rights of women. And, of course, this is in particular the rights of women in the Muslim world. I think all religions present very, very difficult problems for women's existence and women's equal presence in this world and their ability to participate in all aspects of human life. And this is true of all faiths in their most extreme interpretation. And I also think that the approach of some strategists who are highly encouraging, I mean, to hear Richard Pearl speak about women's rights is frankly quite a shock to me, because I hadn't heard it in the decades previously. The approach that women's rights is and the empowerment of women is the soft underbelly of Islam, actually something that has been said to me, is a very disturbing approach to what I believe is a fundamental right that must be supported in all societies. So I would just make that point.
Well, we're practically out of time. I mean, this has been obviously an enormously rich discussion. These are issues that are not easily resolved in a question and answer. Before I give the panelists a final opportunity for remarks, let me just invite everyone, right after this session, just next door in the Parson Room, there's an experiment, an innovation in WEF. There's going to be this intellectual bazaar and a wall of exchange as well. That's going to focus precisely and enable for debate and discussion, not just question and answer, on the war against terrorism. So right after this session, if you want to continue this discussion, I know there's many hands up as well that I haven't gotten to, please just move next door. Finally, very briefly, let me give each of the panelists roughly 90 seconds to either reflect or to wrap up or to give their final statement. And let's start with Mr. Barak.
I will use the opportunity to answer the woman issue. We in Israel tried it. We had a woman prime minister named Golda Meir. She was a great prime minister. She sent me to all these anti-terror raids that I discussed earlier. She was a very tough lady. She saw that there is no Palestinian people at all. And it didn't work at the time. But maybe we have now to... and Arafat was already there. So maybe we now try to find a Palestinian Indira Gandhi. Maybe it will work better.
Okay. Sundeep?
Well, I think he had the last word on the women. I won't say a word about that. I would make another practical suggestion to conclude. And in view of all the confusion that's there about terrorism and 223 definitions that will surface on the net if you do a Google search, perhaps it's vital to consider to create some kind of an international expert group on terrorism, which reflects the point of view coming from the West as well as from some of the Islamic countries as well as other countries, and also non-Islamic concept of terrorism. So we need to deal with terrorism as a serious issue and not merely as a political issue. Thank you.
Gareth?
I think we'd make major progress if we stopped talking about the war against terror and started just, which carries with it the implications, one big cause, one big context, one big kind of response, and lends itself to the defensive reactions of people like Umra for perfectly understandable reasons. The truth of the matter is there are multiple causes, there are multiple contexts, and there are multiple appropriate responses, and they're not all operational, as Ehud was still really trying to want to say, I think. A lot of the responses do demand addressing the political grievances. Just one last word on this. Whenever I'm engaged in debates or discussions like this, I always think of the utility of the philosopher Isaiah Berlin's distinction between the hedgehog and the fox. You remember the hedgehog knows one big thing, the fox knows many things. The trouble with those approaching the war on terror, particularly out of the US, is they have approached it as a one big thing, hedgehog kind of an issue. The truth of the matter is when we're talking about terrorism, we've got to be foxes. And the best way to start being foxes is to stop talking monolithic language, war against terror, war on terror, and talk the language of appropriate analysis of very much more complex causes and appropriate responses.
Jessica?
I think the best way to approach the war on terrorism at this point is to think of it as targeted development. I think we need to compete with those Wahhabis that have been building not just ordinary religious seminaries, but extremist madrasas in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and increasingly in Africa. We need to compete with them. We need to build alternatives, and it would be great if if Ambassador Musa would get involved in such a project, I believe. But also, I think it's critically important that we really do remember that terrorism is psychological warfare and that we be very careful not to allow ourselves to give in to the spiritual dread that our enemies are trying to destroy us with.
Mahnaz?
I would just say ditto to Gareth Evans on the global war, and in one particular geography in 2004, I hope we will really use all the instruments that we have to support one very positive development in this larger set of conflicts we face, and that is the India-Pakistan agreement to move forward on peace talks. I think that will do more for helping us feel more secure and safer than many other initiatives that we're currently embarked on. Thank you.
Kenneth?
I'd like to maybe conclude by addressing something that Ehud Barak said earlier. You said, in essence, and forgive me if this is an unfair summary, but in essence, we have to be patient. It's going to take generations to change the Islamic world, and we have to make sure that
They change themselves. We cannot control it.
Okay, and then second, that we have to, and we have to continue in the meantime, we have to continue to pursue security measures. And I'd like to differ with two implications of that. One, the implication that there's nothing we can do about the evolution of the Muslim world, which I think is absolutely false. We can decide whether the West is going to serve as a model, as an example for a different set of values than those expressed by the terrorists, or where we stoop to the level of the terrorists in incomparable lawlessness.
I fully agree with this.
Okay, so I wanted to make that point. Second, when it comes to pursuing security measures, the implication, again, unstated, was that anything goes. And I want to just stress that by all means we have to pursue security measures. To fight only at the level of values and to ignore security would be idiotic, suicidal. But that doesn't mean that, for example, to take an Israeli context, that we should be engaged in assassinations of people who could easily be arrested. It doesn't mean that in places like Guantanamo, we should be ripping up the Geneva Conventions. It doesn't mean that we should be giving uncritical support to people like Karimov in Uzbekistan or Musharraf in Pakistan or the Saudi or Egyptian governments. And so in that sense, I think it's critical that we make distinctions between security measures that are within the law and security measures that flout the law.
Thank you. Well, as moderator, let me briefly reflect. I think what's emerged in the discussion is that there's, I think, three unmistakable challenges that we face from what I've heard. Firstly, we're certainly enmeshed in what is, I think, can only be described as a war of attrition, where our adversaries are attempting to wear down our resolve, and where I think one of the dangers we face is becoming complacent, being lulled into a false sense of security. And certainly some of the challenges that were discussed by the panel underscore how this is, and maybe not only just the defining struggle of our generation, but perhaps a perennial struggle. That's the first thing. The second thing is I think that terrorism and the nature of this struggle is constantly changing and evolving. So therefore, our responses have to be equally as dynamic and equally as innovative. And I think that's a second huge challenge. And then thirdly, I think, is precisely what we've been talking about, that this really is all about a balance. It's a balance between, it's a struggle or a challenge between striking a balance between security and empowering the authorities, those whom we look to protect and defend us, while also preserving fundamental civil liberties, and also, as Kenneth Roth, I think, very accurately described, still maintaining the moral high ground, especially against an intractable, formidable, and invidious enemy like we face in terrorism. So I think, or at least I hope you'll all agree with me, that this has been a brilliant start to the ensuring security thread, global security thread of this year's conference, and that you'll join me in thanking the panelists for really enormously prescient and insightful comments, and invite you all next door to continue this debate and discussion.